Chapter 6 We see how Gayuri takes his lessons from Bandy syndrome. Gayuri begins to figure out how to survive in the concentration camp. He spends much of his time with Bandy syndrome, whom Gayuri observes in order to figure out what to do and what not to do. He takes care to bathe every day. He learns to save his bread so that he can eat pieces of it each morning and at lunch. Gayuri considers methods of escape from the concentration camp. It is no easy task to escape, not the least because when people are missing from roll call in the morning, a search party is formed. It is disheartening to see the party return with a dead body. Gayuri spends more of his time escaping into his imagination, where he sees his father and stepmother. Sometimes they are arguing with his biological mother. Even his imagination has limits. There is a wide diversity of people in the camp. He also meets people whom he calls the Finns. The Finns do not consider Gayuri Jewish because he does not speak Yiddish. Although Gayuri learns a great deal about surviving in the camp, he nevertheless realizes that no matter what he does, he is wasting every day. He realizes that he has become an old man, a process that would take decades outside the camp. When he carries a bag of concrete, which used to be so easy, Gayuri now spends every step thinking that he cannot go another step. Somehow he continues. Chapter 7 We see some of the sufferings of Gayuri in the camp. Gayuri finds that everything around him has lost significance. He is resigned to his fate, except that now he is more irritable. He does not like people touching him. During the roll call, he will let himself lie down regardless of whether the ground beneath him is dry. The people around him in line will lift him up, but he does not care. Bandy is irritated by Gayuri's defeat and he takes Gayuri to wash. However, Gayuri tells Bandy repeatedly that he would like to be left alone. Finally, Bandy also gives up on him and begins to avoid Gayuri. Now, when Gayuri eats, he does so absent-mindedly. He eventually notices a red swelling around his knee, but cannot muster the will to go to the hospital. It is far away, and it would require him to miss supper. However, when Bandy discovers Gayuri's new wound, he and several others take Gayuri to the hospital. The doctors have nothing to offer Gayuri for the pain, but they cut the wound and drain the pus that is collecting inside. They then wrap the knee in a bandage and put Gayuri on a bed to recover. He learns that winter has begun and he sees patients who are losing their toes to the cold. He sees men whose toes have been amputated from the winter. There are lice and fleas in the hospital and they are swarming on Gayuri. He soon accepts that he cannot defeat them, but he is discouraged when they begin to feed upon his open wound. He is even more discouraged when he discovers a second red swelling on his hip. It becomes clear that Gayuri will likely not return to work and so is loaded onto a train that will take him back to Buchenwald. However, for the most part, he finds that he is no longer associating himself with his body. He no longer associates his identity with his body. It is as though he has been freed from the body's irritations. However, when he looks at the camp and its signs of movement, he is surprised by the irrational thought that he would like to live a little more longer in this beautiful concentration camp. Chapter 8 We see Gayuri back in the Buchenwald camp. When asked whether he has diarrhea, he says that he does not. He considers that it must have been pride that kept him from admitting it. He is picked up and carried over the shoulder to recover in a clinic. However, he slowly begins to heal. He meets other patients, Czech, Polish, French, and even a Russian. He also encounters prisoners who have the lowest numbers that he has ever seen. Their bands mark them as having pure German ancestry. As Gayuri spends more time in recovery, he seems to gather a stronger will to live. Gayuri's wounds continue to require attention, but he is horrified when he realizes that they have begun to heal. The visits to the doctor are now less frequent, not to mention briefer. The doctors now look satisfied when they see his wounds healing. However, the war is slowly reaching the concentration camp, and the sounds of war can now be heard in the distance. There is an announcement over the loudspeaker for all the prisoners to assemble, though Gayuri and others do not respond. Later, there are orders for the SS soldiers and not the prisoners to assemble and depart from the camp. On a late April evening, the last news arrives. The senior inmate announces on the loudspeaker that the prisoners are now free. Gayuri slumps into his pillow and allows himself to seriously consider freedom. Gayuri decides to return to Hungary after spending 1 year in the concentration camps. Along the way, he continuously meets people who ask him about the atrocities that he endured. He stops to find Bandy syndrome, but his family answers the door claiming that he is not home. They have had no word of Bandy, but Gayuri cannot answer whether he still lives as he was moved to a different camp. He also meets a journalist who proceeds to ask Gayuri questions about his experiences in the camp. The journalist feels that people must face the truth of the camps, no matter how painful it might be. When asked whether he was beaten, Gayuri responds naturally. The journalist thinks that this is unnatural, but Gayuri explains it is perfectly natural to be beaten while in a concentration camp. As the conversation ends, Gayuri explains that he is going home to see his family. The journalist asks whether he might come home with Gayuri to photograph his family reunion, but he ultimately settles for leaving Gayuri with his contact information. When Gayuri does return to his home, a woman answers the door. He does not know her. The woman tries to close the door. She says that this is the place where she lives. Gayuri looks up the address. She locks the door. Gayuri does end up finding his uncle and aunt Fleshman as well as his uncle Steiner. They explain that his mother is still alive and that his stepmother married Mr. Suto. She managed to hide away the family's fortune. Encourage Gayuri to put aside his past experiences so that he can begin living again. Gayuri begins talking and finds himself discussing steps and fate. Inside the camps, everyone was in a line and taking steps. He considers fate and he decides that if there is fate, there is no freedom. Therefore, people are their own fate. When Gayuri's father had been taken away, the family had taken its own steps. Gayuri begins to walk to his mother's place. He looks at the sky and sees that this was the time that was his favorite hour in the camp. He feels a sense of nostalgia and homesickness. He realizes that life in the camp had been clearer and simpler. As he looks around, Gayuri finds himself a readiness to continue his life, even if it is uncontinuable. He thinks about his mother's plans for him to become a doctor or an engineer and realizes that there will be happiness for him. After all, between the chimneys and the torments, there was happiness. Although everyone asks about the atrocities, he decides that he will speak about the happiness of the concentration camps, since it might be the most memorable part of having been there unless he forgets it.